Hello, and welcome to Discord Q&A number 34. Just a quick note, if anything is weird about this video, like especially about the uploading, apologies, I won't be able to fix it probably until I actually get back to LA, because I'm recording this early, which I do for some of the videos anyway, but I'm recording this early and I'm going to plan to set it up to automatically upload on Saturday at a normal time, but I will be out of town, so instead I won't be able to handle anything with it until I get back. So yeah, if anything's weird, sorry. But it is what it is. Starting out, we got health version of Medjai's where stacks give bonus HP or other types of Medjai's. So let's talk about the health version of Medjai's first, then I'll get into the other types of Medjai's. The health version of Medjai's is an item that we've had in the game before. It's called Leviathan. And I think there's a lot of reasons, like a lot of really good reasons why it was removed from the game. There's this popular, back in the day, there was this popular thing people used to say about Leviathan. I'm not sure if it's actually like what the origin of it was. I remember, seeing it in a Civ HD video. I don't know if that's actually where it originally came from, or if that was just something people said before and Civ HD popularized it. Not really sure, but what people used to say about Leviathan is like, okay, well, what's the one weakness of Leviathan? Is like, well, you can die and lose your stacks. And like, what does Leviathan prevent? Dying and losing your stacks, right? Basically, once you got the snowball rolling on Leviathan, it was very hard to actually die and lose your stacks because the vector that you were scaling as you got ahead was defensive, right? And the whole gameplay around like stacking and having risk around dying doesn't really make sense when the thing that you're scaling by by succeeding is defensive, right? Like you're getting defensively more powerful as you succeed. That whole output, like that whole structure doesn't really make sense, right? Like Medjai's as an offensive output, on the other hand, does make sense because they might have a ridiculous amount of AP from their Medjai's, and they have a insane amount of like overly efficient gold invested in their Medjai's if they have 25 stacks, but that doesn't make them tankier, right? Obviously, there's some cases where it's like, yes, Lux W has a bigger shield, but for the most part, when someone has a highly stacked Medjai's, they're just as easy to kill as someone who has a zero stacked Medjai's or someone who builds another item. Yes, sometimes maybe having a highly stacked Medjai's might make them, build a little bit more defensively. Maybe they get Azonias or whatever. But for the most part, the differences are relatively minor, right? Whereas Leviathan, uh, where you're scaling a huge amount of defensive output just purely on the item itself, and then you can build other defenses in your other slots as well, like pure defenses. The whole risk reward structure around the item just doesn't really make sense, right? Because it's supposed to be a risky item to opt into, where there's a lot of there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and in return, you get in the optimal scenarios where you are succeeding, you get this really big payoff. And if we were to balance the item, we could never really pay it off very well because the item itself would be making essentially solves its own counterplay, right? So I think health version of Medjai's, like I don't think Leviathan will be returning. Now, other types of Medjai's is kind of interesting. We have some other like Medjai's like items in the game, right? Hubris, for example, in the AD lethality space, is sort of to some degree a modern take on what Sword of the Occult would be. And Sword of the Occult is the AD equivalent to Medjai's that was in the game many years ago as well. For those of you not familiar with that, but Hubris essentially is kind of what you're talking about here. I think Hubris is a really interesting take on a more mild version of what a Medjai's, like what a modern Medjai's could look like. And I want to be clear, like I'm not saying Medjai's is bad, like just because it's old, right? I think the item is actually quite compelling in its current form, but it is really, really, really incredibly sharp. It's really, the outputs it has are really extreme. I think that, there's a possibility that we could make items like that, but I'm not seeing any really obvious opportunity spaces for that. I don't think that, like, for example, it makes a lot of sense to add another one of those to like the AD system when Hubris exists, right? And so I think any version of that in the AD system would probably require that Hubris is a different item. And those are the two primary primary offensive scaling vectors that exist in League, and like AD and AP. And so I look at that and I say, okay, well, this item doesn't really make sense if you're scaling a defensive vector. I don't think utility vector scaling in this makes a lot of sense, like movement speed, for example. I don't think that makes a lot of sense to me. And there's also some overlap with Medjai's because Medjai's also gives movement speed, right? Um, and so I'm not really sure on what another like Medjai's like item would look like. One thing that would be weird is like you could imagine like, oh, what about attack speed or haste? It's like, well, that's kind of weird. Like having highly variable attack speed and haste over the course of a fight are things that I don't really love. Like they affect the feel of your character and like how you're how you press your buttons, like how you actually move and things like that. And I think that doesn't seem super compelling. So I don't see any obvious opportunities for a new Medjai's, but I don't think that necessarily means that we couldn't make one if we found a really, if we found a really good space for that. Maybe there's something that I'm not seeing here, right? It's not a space that I've like deeply thought about a lot of like, wow, you know, what would another one of these look like? Because the reality is, I don't think that we look at the item system in its current form and say, oh, yeah, we really want to get some new mega snowball items into this system, right? That's not ever been something that I've said when I've been, working on items, is that in general, over the years that I've been working on the item system, we've generally wanted to actually reduce the snowballiness of the item system for the most part, right? Like that, as an example, that was one of the main goals of the 1419 changes. And not that I worked on those, that was the live pod doing those at the time. But many of the things that we've tried to do over the last few years have been reducing the value and the snowballiness of gold, because we've introduced other forms of snowballing and more forms of snowballing your gold, right? Like plates, as an example, is like just there's just more gold that's available if you're ahead in the game. And so maybe there will come a day when we do start looking into these spaces, do start looking for these kinds of opportunities. But from my current perspective, I don't look at the game and say there's a lot of opportunities for like Medjai's like items. I don't see a lot of a lot of potential opportunities there currently. But it's possible that there are some if I like really investigate it deeply. Maybe there's a really compelling version of like a Medjai's like I don't know, like I was just going to say magic pen, but that doesn't really make sense because that kind of competes with Medjai's. I'm not really sure. Right off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything that seems compelling. Maybe there is something out there though. But that's kind of my thought on the whole situation. Why isn't reducing AA/ability ranges used more often for balancing compared to increasing them? As an example, why not nerf Blitz hook range? So there's a few really big reasons why we don't do this on basically ever. Like there's a very small handful of examples of where we've done this over the years, right? Like Azir, for example, we've reduced Azir's range, like on his soldier attacks and his Q. But in general, the main reason why we don't do this is that it causes an extremely massively painful relearning cost whenever we do this, right? We've tested this a number of times internally, and almost every single time when we test this internally, we come to the conclusion this just can't be the right way of nerfing this champion. It's almost always better to find other ways because it is so incredibly painful for a player to have to relearn that something that worked from a range perspective the previous patch no longer works, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily apply always to like attack range. I think that there are probably cases where we could and should reduce attack ranges. I think especially some of our melee champions, right? I think, for example, I've said this before, but I think we have too many 175s. I think we should have more 150s. Like I think there's a number of 125s that should go up to 150 and a number of 125s that should go down to 150. Number of 200s that should go down to 175 or maybe even 150. Don't need to get into all of that stuff, but in general, what we're looking for here when we when we don't do reduction changes is just it is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly painful for someone who has played potentially hundreds or thousands of hours of a champion to have to relearn that something is lower range, right? Like it's one of the most painful things we've ever done to Azir, for example. It took literally years for Azir players to get used to this. And so it's incredibly painful. And when we increase them, we do not see the same effect, right? Like when we increase the range on Lee Sin Q or Blitzcrank Q, for example, and just give players a new capability, the difference between those two things is that all of the things that they were doing in the previous, many years they'd played Lee Sin or Blitzcrank or whatever, all the things that they used to do still work. They just have new capabilities they can explore. But none of the things that they were doing previously have stopped working. And when you compare that, like imagine being a Lee Sin player and discovering that a combo that would have worked on a previous patch, like it would have literally functioned. I'm not saying it would have like killed them, right? Like I think damage numbers are fine to change, right? Like those change like variably throughout the game all the time, and so people are used to those changing, right? But something like a range where like, oh, I can ward hop here and Q to this person at the edge of my range and that will work. Like that changing fundamentally alters the way that people play a character in a way that is extremely painful. And we generally don't avoid these, not necessarily because they wouldn't make for good balancing levers otherwise. They probably would, though it's hard to say because, again, we don't really use them that often. But ultimately, it's just this tends to be just way too painful to ever really consider. Um, like reduction of range. Even though like there are some individual spells where it might be appropriate. Like as an example, I think Syndra's QE goes too far, right? I just think she has too much long range agency, and she has too much output at super long range. However, it would be incredibly painful for us to change like the range on that combo, and like how far Syndra's reach is. It's like a fundamental reshaping of how the character plays, just changing that range. And that's another thing that's also the case here is a lot of ranges, if you ever change them, it really reshapes how the character's power manifests, right? You can imagine a version of Syndra as an example that has a little bit lower range, who probably has a bit more DPS, might have a little bit more burst, right? Like she could get that power back in other places, but it's a fairly different version of the character, right? Like it's a subtle difference, if we're talking about like 50 range on their combo, right? Same thing with say like Lee Sin and Blitzcrank, right? Like they got extra range on their spells, and that means that they on average probably don't get to be as quite as powerful at doing some of the other things that they do, but we believe that that was worth it, right? Now with Blitzhook specifically, like this is a good example. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but with Blitzhook range, we explicitly want Blitzhook to be definitively the best hook in the entire game, and we don't want it to be a topic of contention, right? That you're like, oh man, sometimes Thresh Hook is actually really good, and like maybe I should, if I'm just looking for someone to hook someone, I should think about Thresh. No, if you want to hook someone, we want Blitzcrank to be the champion to pick, right? And so that was the main reason why we buffed the range years ago. Was at the time it had become kind of murky, like what hook is the best in the game, and like which hook champion is actually the best at leveraging the power of their hook to kill people. And so we said, okay, well, look, if Blitzcrank Hook has more range, it'll have a very clear output that the other hooks don't have, which is that it just will have more range than, like a lot more range than them, and it will just be able to pick people off from further away in ways that we felt like were pretty appropriate for Blitzcrank. And so ultimately, what I'll say about this is I do think some of the attack range stuff, I do think like a 25 attack range change is something that people could get used to. It's still painful, though I don't think it's quite as painful as an ability range. And especially I think for certain champions that like their attack isn't necessarily their most important thing. I think we could reduce ranges at some points, right? Like as an example, I suspect that Varus is probably a champion that Varus players are probably happier with, and we could make a lot more powerful if he had 550 range. I'm not saying we're going to do that, but uh, Varus being 575 is a lot of what makes him a really high MMR skewed lane bully that has to be tuned a lot around pro, or at least that's the kind of assumption here. I think that's probably true. But there's a number of things about this of like just like the relearning cost here is insanely high, and ranges have a lot to do with the profile of a champion. And so when we lower them, we're significantly changing the profile of the champion in ways that might not be desirable. And so generally speaking, we often spend a lot of time, especially in the more modern champions, we spend a lot of time tuning ranges very intent, like with great intent when we develop a champion, because we know we're probably not going to lower those ranges later, and we're rarely even going to increase them, right? Like how many range increase changes have we done over the years? Not that many, right? Like certainly more than range decreases, but not that many over the years, right? Even attack range increases, we haven't done that many of over the years, right? And most of them were like very early on in a champion's lifetime. Like for example, Kaisa, the patch after her release, we gave her 25 attack range as an example, right? And so we don't even really increase attack range or spell ranges very often either. In general, this is just a really, really, really significant change to the shape of a character and like how their power manifests. And so we just don't do it that often because we don't often want to completely reshape the power or like where the power of a character is manifesting. And often it's better to do that through numbers, because that won't affect the feel of the character quite as much. Could Yunara ever get Zeried? And this person was specifically asking for less range, bring back some damage slash speed. So this is a topic that has been a topic of pretty real discussion internally a number of times. I will not claim to be an expert in this space. What I'll say is that I think a lot of the people who are more knowledgeable about like Yunara, her audience, her goals, generally do like keeping her range. I do think that the version of Yunara who is not 575 attack range is probably a lot easier to tune and a lot easier to make a powerful, speedy attacker, because having a range advantage, like even a 25 range advantage, is one of the things that makes Yunara incredibly powerful in the laning phase, right? The fact that she has an attack reset in lane combined with being higher range than other AD carries and having a movement speed advantage on most of them, that like those factors, even though Yunara doesn't even really like have much in the way of real spells, right? When you compare this to like, Lucian Q and E, or like Sivir Q and E, right? Like Yunara is kind of lacking a lot of those spells, right? Her W is not nearly as like as reliable of a spell as like a lot of other AD carry spells out there. It definitely has its moments, right? Like there are moments where it's quite powerful, but the reality is just being higher range combined with having an attack reset and being faster than other AD carries gives her an enormous amount of laning phase agency to kind of dominate other AD carries in the 2v2. And uh, to some degree that was intended, right? Was it intended to be as like as powerful as it is? I'm not sure, but I don't believe so, right? I'm not, not familiar. I didn't really work on Yunara at all. And so I think my answer here is, to me, this is possible. I'm not an expert on Yunara, and the people who worked on Yunara, including Yellow, generally seem to prefer, hey, we want to keep the range. And we think that the range has value, like, her being 575 and having a higher range profile than other AD carries has value to her, as, it, brings her a somewhat unique strength, not completely unique, right? Varus is also 575. But it is a unique strength that she has. It is something that's different that she brings to the table comparatively to other, simple auto attackers, right? Like, like her. And so my answer to this question, which, first of all, is like, I would recommend trying to find Yellow. He would, I'm sure, have a much, much, much better read on the situation, much more nuanced take, I'm sure, since he did make the champion. And he's, around in some discords from time to time, and so maybe you could find him out there somewhere in the wild if you wanted to ask him this question. But my take is, it's a possibility. I'm not sure what the best version of Yunara is for Yunara players because it's not a topic I'm an expert on. But my perspective is, yes, I think if we took away some of these things, like either the attack, like the attack reset, like the ability for her to just go auto, like with her Q reset, in lane is very powerful, like just incredible lane trading power, or her range advantage, or her laning phase movement speed. Like as an example, if we really went down on the movement speed in the laning phase, we could scale it back up later on. Like I think there's a number of different ways to come at the angle of like if we really wanted to push Yunara as a later game scaling, high damage, high mobility marksman. I think there are ways, like a number of different ways we could get in that. Um, Less range is one of those ways. I don't think it's the only way to do it. We could just make her less powerful in the laning phase, as an example. Like there's a number of different ways of doing that. The attack reset would be one. Giving her lower base AD would be another, like less on hit on her Q, etc. Right? Lots of options. Again, I'm not an expert on the space, but hopefully this has been at least a little bit illuminating of, could Yunara ever get these kinds of changes? Yeah, maybe, right? But I'm not sure that's the best way of changing her. Why is Nidalee the only shapeshifter to have her second form spells leveled up with her R? So there's a little bit of historical precedent here, right? The original version of Nidalee didn't get access to her Cougar form until level 6 when you put a point in the spell. And when that's the case, it makes a lot of sense to just have the spells scale with rank, especially if you want people to put points into the ability. Some of this is tied into what do you get for putting points into the spell, right? With Jace, for example, we solved this problem by saying, well, you don't get anything because you don't put points into your R at all, and instead your basic abilities have 6 ranks. But that actually creates a very well, maybe not very different, but a somewhat subtly different power curve where these champions spike at different levels, whereas Nidalee spikes at 6, 11, and 16 in terms of her burst, whereas that actually wasn't something we wanted for Jace, and so we didn't set up his ability to scale that way. And some of this also comes down to, well, on Nidalee, her Cougar form abilities don't really correspond very well to her human form abilities, right? Like if you look at Elise as an example, you look at her Q and it's, okay, that's the burst single target tool. The W is DPS and poke, which is kind of like other non-burst damage essentially, right? The explosive spiderling is a little bit of burst too as well, right? But the W is like sort of the other kinds of damage, and then E is utility in both forms, right? Whereas when you look at Nidalee, her human form E is a form of defensive utility. Her human form W is also a form of utility, but it's vision based, and it marks people. And then her Q is her damage. When you look at her Cougar form, it's like, okay, all of the spells are actually about burst damage, but her E is a wave clear, sort of AoE tool, right? Like wave clear or like, jungle clearing tool, especially, prior to jungle pets when the jungle pet will handle most of the AoE for you. And the W is the mobility tool. And so you could sort of, I think, look at it like, well, I guess W is sort of utility, but like not like, if you sort of squint a little bit. But generally speaking, the correspondence between the human and cougar form abilities for Nidalee aren't nearly as well formed, I would say, as Elise's. And that's not a criticism of Nidalee, by the way, right? Like, I think that's fine. It's just that means that we probably should change the paradigm of like how your spells scale, right? And this is a manifest. Like, the answer to this question is a manifestation of that, right? Which is, well, we don't really care about which spell. Oh, sorry about the Windows system notification. But we don't really care about which spell Nidalee is maxing. We want our cougar form gameplay to be very similar. Whereas, this is before my time, but this like what I understand is Elise was actually intended to have a fairly different W second max versus E second max profile, where the idea was you max Q first, and then when you max W, you get other forms of damage, and when you max E, you get more utility. And of course, we've actually seen versions of Elise in the past that maxed E second and got to have more of that utility and be less about damage and more about rotating multiple cocoons in a fight, etc. Right? And I think that's compelling, right? Whereas I don't think the same thing would be true for different max orders on Nidalee, as an example. And so some of it comes down to just how the spells are positioned in different slots. Ultimately, though, like if you told me you were going to like wave your magic wand and all the form swappers were going to scale like Elise, where they scale just you have normal rank ups and your spells in both forms correspond to the ranks in that like spell slot, I would say okay. I would have some questions about, okay, what are we doing? What does the rank up on Nidalee's R actually do? Because currently it increases the damage of your spells, right? Like that's the main thing it does. And so I would have questions about that, because changing Nidalee to the Jace model, where she doesn't have ranks in her ultimate at all, is a pretty real, different power curve because of the way that your spells are maxed. And Nidalee is shaped to be intentionally focused on early game power. And so I don't think we would want to extend her curve to require her to get a higher level to max out her Q, for example, right? I think it's good that her Q base damage maxes out at level 9 and you are very, very, very powerful. And then you get another spike at level 11 on your burst in cougar form, right? And so generally, I think the structure, each of our transforming champions has their own way of doing spell rank ups and incentives for their primary and their alternate form. And I think that generally they all work and they're maybe like optimized for the way that the champion kit is structured. However, I don't think this is like some massive like, oh my god, this is incredibly important, and if we did something else, everything would fall apart. Right? It's like we'd probably be able to find a way to to make Nidalee feel good about putting points in her R if we really wanted to, and making her spells scale in the same way that Elise's do. Or conversely, if we really wanted to make Elise rank up her spider form abilities with her R ranks, we could probably do that as well. I don't think that this is some incredibly critical thing. However, it's also just not important that these are consistent, right? This is one of those cases where I think there's this general belief, for whatever reason, of like, oh, things should be consistent in all cases, right? Like people often come to me, ask questions of like, why aren't these things the same? And my answer is, well, there's not really a lot of value in them being super consistent, right? What's the upside of Nidalee's spells scaling the exact same way as Elise, right? What's your value proposition here for like why these things should be consistent? Because from my perspective, I kind of look at it and say, are you really getting a lot of value of there being some cross learning and like some relatively higher applicability of your knowledge between these two champions? I don't think so, really, right? Like it's a relatively minor point that you can learn when you look at the ultimate rank up, right? Same thing with, when you compare to Jace, right? I say like, well, you just have 6 ranks of your spells, and don't put points in your ultimate. Pretty easy to learn that. It's a very minor point, and I don't think that we'd be getting a lot of value out of making these things consistent. And so my perspective is basically, well, uh, because we think that the gameplay is probably slightly better on Nidalee when she has her Cougar form abilities ranked up with her R, and we don't value the consistency of making all of these champions the same more than we value a minor gameplay improvement. Is how I view this. Right now, of course, there are limits to this. As an example, if this was something that was wildly inconsistent and you absolutely had to know this to play Nidalee, versus playing Elise, we might reconsider that, right? Like, I'm not saying that consistency has no value at all. Of course, there's value to it. Of you can understand how a champion works by seeing another similar champion or similar effect or whatever, right? There's value in that, but it's not innately something that we must value over all other things in all cases, right? And so in this case, I think we believe the minor gameplay improvement is more valuable than these champions being exactly perfectly mirrors of each other in the shapeshifting case. Do you find eccentric characters such as Bard and Ivern easier or harder to balance? So I kind of look at balance as there's two main portions to what I consider to be balance work. Number one is identifying whether a champion is within the appropriate bands of balance or not. And number two is moving that champion uh, up or down in power, right? When I look at oddball champions like Bard and Ivern, I think it's kind of interesting because they are more difficult to move up or down precisely because we don't have good points of comparison for them like we do for a lot of other champions out there, right? As an example, for an AD carry, there's probably 5 different base stats that we could change a pretty precise amount and get them to move up or down exactly 1 or 2% pretty easily. And then there's probably like 3 or 4 things on any given, for most AD carries, like most standard AD carries, and things that we could change on their spells to get them to move up or down 1 or 2% with no issues at all. And a lot of those things are comparable across the entire class or across large sections of the class, right? Where we can move them up or down pretty easily. And because there's a lot of cross comparison that's enabled there because AD carries they share a lot of properties. We know roughly how much win rate like 4 base AD is, or 0.5 AD growth or 0.5 AS growth, right? We have a really good understanding of what those do. When you look at a champion like Bard or Ivern, we often don't have that that history built up. We don't often know when we change something on their kit that's never been changed before or only been changed once or twice before, what that's going to do in terms of power, right? With Ivern, for example, if I were like trying to give Ivern more DPS and I were buffing his W on hit, I don't know how much damage it would take on his W on hit to give Ivern 1% win rate. Like, is it more like does it take more or less than other champion on hits that I could compare to? I don't know because Ivern's W is really weird. Ivern sometimes gets to leverage it with Daisy. He sometimes puts it on other people, right? Like, I don't know how much, like whether it's more or less powerful point for point than other on hits in the game. And because he's so weird, that's really hard to establish. However, the other part of balance, I actually think is easier for some of these oddball champions, which is figuring out if they are or are not balanced. Because these champions are weird and they tend to stand out really easily, it's often very clear. There's usually some very clear signs when the champion is not like within a reasonable balance range, right? Ivern, for example, is a relatively narrow jungler who is niche. Shouldn't be not only broadly appealing, but also just shouldn't be a champion that's super amazing in like a wide variety of different comps. And so when you start seeing him a lot in elite level play, that probably means Ivern is too strong. That probably means the junglers that are in elite level play, that are just there trying to optimize their win chance by every percentage they can get, they're playing Ivern because Ivern is really strong, right? Conversely, when Ivern is a champion that you never see, like that, doesn't feel like there's any composition where you would ever want an Ivern, and that even when you're playing like a hyper carry in the AD carry position, or you're playing you're playing like double melee solo lanes, etc. When you never want to play Ivern with those kinds of comps. I was sorry about the game invite. I have my league client open. That was someone inviting me to an ARAM mayhem. I'm going to close my client now. Anyway, uh, I lost my train of thought there. What was I talking about? I don't remember what I was talking about. Who cares? It probably was a useless point anyway. But yeah, I think to wrap around on what I was saying, basically, I think that these oddball characters, to sort of get at the whole crux of it, I think these oddball characters tend to be harder to precisely move up or down, but it is easier to understand whether they are within a reasonable balance range or not, because there's not a lot of factors that muddy whether you can see whether they're accomplishing their purpose or not. Right. One of the things that's weird about some of the standard 80 carries, as an example, is like Jinx might not be showing up as much. She might have a lower pick rate because Yunara is strong, or like Varus, is strong, or some other crit. Caitlyn is strong, right? Like, and the people that would normally be playing Jinx are actually just playing Caitlyn because Caitlyn is just on the stronger side, and that's what people want to do right now. Or Caitlyn's particularly good in the meta, or whatever, right? There's a lot of muddying factors on understanding if champions that are more comparable to other champions that are not oddball characters. It's often, I think, more difficult to understand if those champions are correctly balanced or not. But it's easier to move those champions up or down by precise amounts because you have way more to compare to. So ultimately, I guess that my answer here is these champions, these oddball characters like Bard and Ivern, are easier in some ways to balance, and I think harder in others. Is my summary. What are some old abilities that were removed with rework/CGUs that you'd like to try and make a new kit around? So I think there's kind of a couple different ways I look at this. I think this question is kind of posing it as things that I would want to like build entire kits around. I think there's some pretty easy answers I can give you off the top of my head. I think Urgot has a few, right? I think both the old EQ combo, which for those who are not familiar, the old way that the old Urgot worked, his baseline EQ is E was a lob AoE missile. You threw it out, and it would armor shred people that it hit. His Q was a really, really, really bad version of Ezreal Q that did not apply on hits and on attacks like Ezreal Q. It was just a damage, bad version of Ezreal Q, shorter range, higher mana cost, like I think lower damage. I don't remember the exact details. But when there was someone that had your E debuff on them as Urgot, you could Q if your cursor was on top of someone with your E debuff, and your Q, instead of being that line skill shot, kind of like bad Ezreal Q, it would lob the Q directly at that target and it would be guaranteed to hit them. And so that led to this really interesting lock-on gameplay where you could trade and scrap a bit with your bad Ezreal Q, but you would really want to wait till you got a lock-on and then spam your Q on the locked-on target and just go bam, 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 burn through my mana. It's guaranteed to land right now. I'm all hitting you. I'm fighting you. Your armor is shredded, etc. Right, which I think was pretty cool. And I think that lock-on loop was very compelling, and I could see designing an entire kit around it. Uh, Also, Urgot's ultimate, the what was it called, like hyperkinetic position reverser or something ridiculous like that, which was basically suppress an enemy at range, and channel. If your channel, if your channel gets interrupted, it stops the whole thing. But if you complete the channel, you swap positions with the opponent. Uh, and I think that's a really cool spell. Like the fundamental problem with the original Urgot was not that any of his individual spells were like unplayably bad or like unacceptable, right? It was just that his R and his Q, like his R and his basic QE combo had no business belonging on the same kit at all, right? They had like direct anti synergy. His QE told him you're an 80 caster that wants to play at range, and then his R says, by the way, you're going to switch yourself into the middle of the enemy team and go deep, right? So the kit didn't really make sense, but individually, I think either of those pieces I could absolutely see us designing a new kit around. The old Fiora ultimate also, I could see designing a whole kit around. I mean, it's basically just souped up Master EQ, right? It's just better Alpha Strike at an ultimate level of power, which is pretty cool. I think there's a number of old abilities that could have kits built around them. One thing I do want to note is I think the perception around like how designers view old abilities isn't quite right. I think like when I talk to people about this, I think people have this perception that Riot Design looks at old abilities like, oh, pathetic, all these old abilities, they were trash. I kind of look at most of the old abilities that were in the game, like on pre-VGU or CGU kits. In most cases, I kind of look at them as Lego pieces, right? Like that. I think a lot of our older kits, it wasn't that the individual Lego pieces were just bad. I mean, there were definitely some cases, right? Like I think the old Fiora W, for example, is just not a good spell, and I don't think that belongs on any champion. But for most cases, right? Like the old Fiora's Q and E, those were fine spells. Were they amazing, perfect spells? No, right? But there were just Lego pieces that could have worked on a kit given the right context, right? Similarly, something like I don't know, even something today like I don't know, like what's a relatively recent champion like Ambessa's E. It's like this spell is just fine, right? It's not like an amazing spell, but it really works for Ambessa's kit, right? It's the right Lego piece for that kit, even though individually it's not like a super compelling spell design. It's a good spell for Ambessa's kit specifically. And I kind of look at a lot of old effects like that, where I look at a lot of our older champions that we've removed from the game, and it's not that like, the old Aatrox W was like an unusable ability, right? Like I do think there was some weirdness around like the way that the toggle worked and how like it was like the way to optimize the toggle was to almost always in champion combat have the damage version on and then just use the healing version against non-champions. That part I think was kind of uncompelling, and but some of that comes down to tuning. Uh, but the idea of like having a toggle on a champ is like I could believe there could be a cool kit with that in it, even if the kit is not entirely built around it. Again, I kind of look at older abilities as these Lego pieces that can be added to form a really cohesive whole if you have the right piece for the right kit, right? And a lot of that just comes down to constructing kits in such a way that you end up needing a single Lego piece. This is often how kits work, where we often end up feeling really good about like two abilities and an ultimate or the base kit without an ultimate or something like that, and really needing that last piece to fit everything together. And the last piece often isn't some super flashy ability, it's often something super functional, right? Something like, say, a Ambessa R or a Lock E or something like that, right? Like, are these spells that can like really like make a kit cohesive? Like, we know sort of what we generally need in this slot. We know Lock's E needs some kind of mobility tool. He needs something to get to his targets. How does that work? We don't know. When we made the initial versions of Lock, a lot of them were about the Q and the R loop, and we ended up developing the W and the E over time, as ways to fill some of the gaps in his kit to make the kit actually function, to make the Q and R function together, right? And so ultimately, I guess, to answer, like, to get the actual like face value of the question, if you were like, I go into work tomorrow and, or, I guess from your perspective, since this is going to be on a Saturday, it's, 2 days from now. If I were to go into work tomorrow and someone says, hey, you need to make a new kit based on an old champion's, ability, I would probably personally start with the old Urgot R. I think is the one that I think is maybe most interesting, or like I think has the most clear pathway to success, which is putting that ability on a fighter or putting that ability on a tank. I think would make a lot of sense, especially a melee one, right? Not a ranged champion. I think there's a pretty clear pathway to success there. I think the lock-on gameplay of the Urgot Q and E also could work. I think it would be relatively straightforward to make a fighter with the old Fiora ultimate, like make a very light fighter, like skirmisher type champion, where that's their finisher, or that's their opener. I think either one. I don't think you want it to be both. I think you want it to be either the finisher or the opener, so it's clear. Like give the player a clear use case around it. But we don't need to dig in deeper on that. But um, those are the ones that come to my mind just off the top of my head. And like I said, I don't want it, like, I want to be clear that like I think the way that designers tend to look at older abilities is not that they're all like unusable trash or like irredeemable trash. It's just that a lot of them are fine spells that were on kits that were not cohesively designed or like not structured correctly, right? Like, not that on an individual basis all old spells are bad, is how I think about that space. Balancing around different elos and low elos skewed champions slash juggernauts. And this person was asking more specifically, like how much of the game should be balanced around lower versus higher elos. So before I even get into this question or like this topic, one thing I do want to note is if you want a more detailed understanding of like how League's balancing is approached, there are a few older dev blogs from years ago that if you look up like League Balance Framework dev blog or League Oracle Framework dev blog, or some search terms like that, you can find some of the older devlogs that were written that sort of explain some of the balance strategy that we use. And I think that's a really, really good intro to this topic. And so I'm not going to cover the stuff that's in those articles because if you want that information, you can go get it. But I'll talk about my thoughts here, like how we approach balance, how I think about balance, and sort of this topic in general. One thing I do want to note, by the way, is that not all juggernauts are lower, like MMR skewed. Like Darius, as an example, is a high MMR skewed juggernaut, who is actually more powerful as it gets better as you go up in MMR. People tend to look at classes as being monolithic, and they aren't really, right? It is true that most juggernauts are low MMR skewed, but the difference of skew does vary pretty greatly between different champions, and not all of them are even really skewed at all, and not, some of them are even skewed in the opposite direction, right? Like Darius. And so, one thing to note here is that, like, I tend to I tend to look at skew on a champion by champion basis because I think looking at it as a class by class basis is not very useful because there's a lot of outliers and there's a lot of textural differences between the different champions, right? A 6% skew different, like skew champion is very different from a 3% skew champion, for example, right? Like if the difference between like bottom of the, bottom 25% of the players is 6% different from the top, 5% or whatever, that's really, really, really different from a 2% difference or a 3% difference. Anyway, to get at the actual core of the question that's being asked here of like, I think this question is kind of presupposing that there is a binary state of the game must be balanced for lower or higher MMR players. And that's not true, right? The reality is I think we could do a pretty good job of making things functional or viable, right? Depending on what terminology you want to use. I would say functional. Making things functional for a large percentage of players, or maybe even all of our players at the same time, without great sacrifices. Now, I will note there are some cases, outlier cases, where sometimes the skew between like low and high MMR is so large that that's impossible, right? As an example, in the past, if you go back several years before we made a lot of changes to Yorick used to be a champion. I would say this was true of, right? Where his skew difference between low and high MMRs was so large, we could never have a Yorick that was reasonable at all in lower MMRs while also being playable for high skill players. That's not true anymore, right? We did a lot of changes to Yorick, and he's still a low MMR skew champion, but he's very clearly viable and functional for higher skill players, right? He still shows up in pro occasionally, right? He's obviously a functional champion for higher skill players, even though he's low MR skewed, right? And so the way that I look at this question is like, as an example, let's suppose we just like magic up a champion. I'm going to make up some numbers, right? But these numbers are going to be like real, like or like realistic numbers. But I'm not, I didn't go do a bunch of research, so I don't have current data offhand. But like, let's suppose we have a champion with a 3% skew between low and high MMR. That's actually not unusual, right? That's like a pretty normal skew number. It's pretty rare we get many champions above 3%. So this champion is, in the lowest levels of play is 3% higher win rate than in higher levels. So let's suppose we make this champion 52% in lower elos, right? That means they'll be 49% at the top level of play. Let's imagine this champion has some kind of mastery curve because every champion in League has one. So if you play 30 games of this champion, you're going to gain a bunch of win rate, like a fair amount of win rate, right? Maybe you're going to gain 4% win rate. Maybe you're getting in 5%, right? Let's suppose this is a fairly low skill skew champion. Let's suppose it's really unusually low. You're only going to gain 3% win rate. Well, you play 30 games this champion and they're 48, they're 49, maybe they're 48% win rate, right? Like depending on skew, right? Like again, I made up all these numbers. So, but the reality is just if you're willing to put in the time and the effort for most champions that have reasonable skew, that are tuned to be like if they're like low MR skewed, we typically tune them to be pretty strong in lower MMRs, right? And that allows them to be functional for higher skill players. If you're willing to put in the time and the effort to master the champion, they're going to be really strong. Additionally, some champions have situational context, right? Yorick is a really good example where Yorick has some matchups where he's like plus 5%, right? So even if Yorick is 47% win rate in higher MMRs, which he's not, by the way, but like imagine he was, there still might be some matchups where he's effectively like a 51 or 52% champion, right? And so what I get at here, or what am I saying? What I'm getting at here is that there's a lot of situational context, and in most cases, we're able to tune champions such that they're stronger for like if they are low MMR skewed, we typically tune them to be strong for the low MMR players, and then they are what I would call like within bounds for higher skill players, where if you're willing to put in the time and the effort to climb the mastery curve a meaningful amount, or play them in situations where they're clearly more powerful, they are very like by win rate clearly functional and viable for higher skill players. And that's how I think we typically want to balance these low MMR skewed champions. Again, I'm not saying that's true for literally every single case. Some champions are skewed in really extreme ways, and in general, we've tried to wear those down over the years, right? Again, Yorick, I think, is the best example where it absolutely was true that years ago we just couldn't make the numbers work on Yorick because of how insanely like skewed he was between low and high MMR. And Garen also used to be like this as well if you go even further back, right? And so in general, my perspective here is it's not about whether the game is balanced for lower or higher elos. It's about how uh how much can we make it so that uh, a champion who might be lower MMR skewed can still be functional for high skill players. To be clear, I'm not saying that Garen should be the best thing that you can play in Diamond Plus or Master Plus gameplay, but I don't think it's a problem if Garen is a functional pick for those players, right? The reality is almost nothing is the best thing that you can be playing on any given patch in any given role, right? Like there's going to be a small handful of things that are optimal, right? Because just there's going to be more than one of them in each role, just due to like matchups and comps and some other situational context, right? But ultimately, there's not going to be very many champions in a given role that are the optimal thing. And so, to me, having a champion who is a bit weaker than the other champions, but still totally viable, totally playable, I think is totally a functional champion that you can get above 50% either through mastery or through matchup or situational context, whether that's your composition, enemy composition, whatever. That I think is how we should approach these things. That's generally how we do approach these things, and I think it's just a good strategy. And that means that we don't have to pick and choose. Oh, do we balance this champion for lower or higher MMRs? We just kind of say, yeah, this champion gets to be a bit strong in lower MMRs, and that means that they're functional and viable for higher ones. And I think that's great, right? And I think in the cases that we do have where we have a champion that is so skewed that we can't do that, I think that's where we should be considering larger scale changes to maybe reduce the skew a little. Which, to be clear, I'm not saying we should eliminate it, right? I think that Yorick probably should be a lower, more skewed champion. It's just there's a question of degrees here, right? It's not that we can't have skewed champions to lower or higher MMR. We absolutely can. It's just there are degrees to which I think we go too far, and we actually can't effectively balance them for different skill brackets, right? Uh, and so that's how I look at this entire topic of just, I think we kind of can have it all as long as we sort of math things out to be within certain bounds. And sure, this will not result in champions like Yorick or Garen generally being the best things to play in higher MMRs, but they'll still be viable and functional there. And I will say, like, there have definitely been some patches where Garen was just so strong, and by the way, his skew is not that large these days, so it's like that like he's not even necessarily a champion I would call I would put in this category these days. But um, there have definitely been some patches where like, oh, one of these champions like Yorick, I think is probably a better example, who was low and more like who still is low and more skewed, was so insanely strong on the patch that he was also the best thing to be playing in higher MMRs. And that I think is just like, yeah, we just need to do balance work and make sure that that's not true. There's obviously a lot of work that goes into this, but in general, the way that I look at this entire topic is we don't have to pick and choose. There are some steps, like there's a process we can go through to kind of get the best of all worlds, or maybe not the best of all worlds, but get a lot of the good for all players. Because one of the values that we're trying to get at here, right? Some players, when I talk through this through, some people will ask me like, well, why even bother? Like, why not just let Amumu or Garen or Yorick or whoever you're talking about be a good champion in low elo and not let them be viable in high elo. I don't want to see Amumu in my Master Plus lobby. It's like, well, I think there's a lot of value in if you're a player who plays a champion and goes increases in skill and gets better at the game, that you can still play your champion even as you get better and better, right? I think it's kind of a sad thing if you're a really big Amumu player in silver and you get a lot better, you go to diamond and your champion is suddenly no longer viable. And that's a really I think really devastating like fail state for those players that get better playing these champions. And so again, the goal is not that Amumu is the best thing that you can play in Diamond, but that he's still a viable option if you've put in the time and the effort to master him, or you want to pick him in the situations where he's really good. And that's sort of how I view this topic. Rudon's Caitlyn interaction. So, for those of you not familiar, this is an interaction Caitlyn used to have where Rudon's bolts would stack her headshot, would like, add stacks to her headshot counter. The thing is, though, Caitlyn's headshot is an on-attack effect, and so only the primary attack could consume the headshot. Now, this interaction being removed, I want to be clear, this was before I joined Riot. Like, I was not there, right? And so I'm going to be giving you a mix of my personal opinion and my understanding of what was the logic at the time, right? And maybe this wouldn't, maybe we would do things differently today if we were presented with the same situation. I don't know, right? But I think the main sort of core of the issue as people saw it back then, and I think, for me personally, I think this still holds up today, is that when Caitlyn bought Runons and the bolts stack your headshot, Runons was actually better for single target damage than any other Zeal item in the game, as long as your Runon's bolts were hitting other targets, because it was contributing extra stacks to your headshot, which then gave you more single target than something like a Phantom Dancer. And so the perspective of the time was, hey, Caitlyn is kind of cheating with this item, where she's getting the value of the AoE. It's giving her wave clear, it's giving her this AoE damage, but it's also giving her more single target damage than the options in the item system that are literally supposed to do that, right? And so the item system, like structure, was kind of broken for Caitlyn, where, hey, you can buy these Zeal items, right? And the intended positioning of Phantom Dancer versus Runons, back then, and this still holds up today, this is still how we use them, was PD was supposed to be the best single target DPS option. This offers you the most raw stats. It gives you the best damage, DPS, right? Whereas Runons gives you a bunch of utility and AoE, wave clear, all these other effects, and the trade-off is supposed to be single target damage. And so the problem with Caitlyn having this interaction was she got everything from just having Runons. She was cheating the single target damage in a way that felt kind of inappropriate, I think, at the time, where she just got everything with no trade-offs. Now, to be clear, there are other champions that cheat the item system in similar-ish ways, though I think this was a more significant, like, sort of cheating of the item system than others that were, more permissive of, right? Where generally speaking, there are champions that have really, 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 really powerful interactions with certain items that kind of preclude them from buying other items, or give them this really powerful synergy that lets them, kind of acquire the effects of, multiple items, or like, not acquire the effects of multiple. That's not how I should put this. Acquire the effects that sort of represent, multiple items that would go in a similar slot. Like the Zeal, like AOE versus single target kind of thought. But ultimately, the conclusion at the time was, this is over the line. She's just getting too much value from this item, and we can't sustain this interaction, because the only thing that could be done would just be to nerf her DPS, and then she becomes even more reliant upon this interaction. Now, I think there is something to the idea, especially in the more modern day, as we've learned a lot more about the item system of, hey, it's okay if a champion is dependent upon an item, as long as that interaction feels really good for them and it feels like something that works really well for them. And so I think that there's maybe some room for the discussion today around, like, is this something that would feel really good for Caitlyn, and should we just say, like, nerf Caitlyn by 0.5% or whatever and give her this interaction back, and just say, yep, Caitlyn, you get to have AoE and single target when you build this. Because to be honest, I'm generally of the opinion in the modern day, when it's really hard to get a lot of AD carries to buy Zeal items, that we should generally be doing things that encourage AD carries to buy Zeal items, even if that means that the Zeal item does something that's a little bit messed up for them, right? Which is part of the reason why I made Feed Hunter bolts, for example. Anyway, but at the same time, also something I'll note is that we've made headshot quite powerful over the years, and so I suspect the end result here is that we probably have to nerf headshot if we wanted to, bring back this interaction, even if we thought that, it was like healthy or like above the gameplay bar. I suspect that headshot would have to be nerfed. And I think that that's something where, I'm not actually sure that that's really what Caitlyn players would want. Would you really want this interaction if it came at the cost of how powerful your headshot scaling would be? It means you're less good at, like, bursting people with your headshots. It means that you're going to, even if you have way more headshots available, each individual one will be a lot less exciting, a lot less powerful, right? I suspect that would be the road we'd have to go down. And I'm not, again, I'm not claiming to know the answer here. I'm not telling you like this could never happen or anything like that. What I'm saying about this interaction is I think a lot of the logic as to why it was removed in the first place still holds up today. Uh, but also it's something where there's some clear value that I could see in re-enabling this around like, well, it would make Caitlyn really excited about a zeal item, which is something that we do like. AD carries wanting zeal items a lot, and so there's some value in that. And there's just generally, I think, value in shifting our AD carries more towards DPS rather than burst. I do think a number of AD carries, and Caitlyn is a good example, have been shifted too much towards burst over the years. And so there's some competing values here. I don't have the answers off the top of my head, but hopefully this has at least been at least a little bit informative about the my thoughts on the topic and some of the historical context here. Why is GA such a performant third item? And I'm going to actually kind of group this together a little bit with the next question, which is why is Dawn Core so underplayed despite being the biggest win rate enchanter item? These questions are both kind of getting into the complexities of item data. The reality is that item data is very complicated. Champion win rate data, to be honest, is also somewhat complex, but much less complex overall than item data. There are so many different things you have to consider about item data, like so many external factors, and you'll never really even know every single factor, right? Even if you spent hundreds and hundreds of hours doing your research, you'll never really know every factor that's affecting items win rates. Because here's something that's just like, as an example, one thing that we know for sure is true because it's been observed over you can logic it out, and it's also been easily observed that this is true. But more expensive items have higher win rate, and the reason for that is that when the game win rate of items gets recorded when the game ends, if you're ahead, you're more likely to have a finished item, right? And so when you look at something like GA as an example, if it's when you look at something like Dawn Core, which is the most expensive enchanter item in the entire game, of course it's going to have a higher win rate than all the other enchanter items. It's expensive, which means that if you were buying it and you actually finished it and the game ended, it's way more likely you were ahead. This actually doesn't even get into the psychological aspect of you're more likely to buy expensive items when you're ahead, and therefore when you're more likely to win. GA, I think, is actually one where I evaluate the psychological aspect of it quite a bit. Of like, people buy GA to secure a win. People who are losing are often not going to go GA because I think the assumption that a lot of people have is like, well, if I'm losing and I get a GA, what's the point, right? I'm just going to die twice, right? If the enemy team is ahead, I should build more damage. I should build like a lethality item, or I should build more health, so I might be able to survive a burst spell or whatever, right? And like get my next spell off or something along those lines. And so I think there's a lot of context here around, well, like when items have high win rates, when items are performant versus when they're not. And I'm not going to get into all of these details because they're like, to be honest, there's just too many small things to cover. There's a lot of small things that affect item win rates, item data. But I think a lot of the reality here comes down to some of the like simple guiding principles that I find useful when I'm looking at item data is things that are built only in later slots will be higher win rate, right? This applies to Dawn Core. Dawn Core both is a scaling item that is really only good when you have other, other items in the system. So it's only going to be built in the later slots, whereas conversely, almost every other enchanter item has some valid purchase or in the earlier slots. And so that on its own is going to raise the win rate because, of course, as mentioned earlier, when the game ends, the winning team has more items than the losing team in almost all cases, right? Which means items in later slots have higher win rate, right? Because if you just take this at the most basic example, the winning team all has 3 items, the losing team all has 2 items. Therefore, that raises the win rate of the items in the third slot, and that's a really common scenario, right? Additionally, more expensive items have higher win rate, right? That means you had more gold to spend on average, right? If someone in the exact same situation was doing the exact same build as you and didn't finish that item, then they're more likely to they're more likely to have lost. If they finish the item, they're more likely to have won because that means they had more gold, right? And having more gold means that they were more likely to win, right? Because gold is strongly correlated with winning. Surprise, surprise, right? Performance is also definitely manipulated by like how and when people buy items, right? Medjai's has crazy win rate as an example, but obviously Medjai's is generally purchased from an ahead position, and that is, a lot of why the item is, appears extremely powerful, right? Maybe not the only factors. I think the item is actually also just factually quite strong, but that's another thing with GA where I think a lot of people look at GA as a way to secure a win, or forgive any errors that you make in trying to close the game. And so that lends itself really effectively to an item that is used to close out games from ahead, where you're already more likely to win, whereas it's less likely to be purchased from behind. And so a lot of this just comes down to both combinations of player psychology and small, like, mathematical things that just end up being, yeah, more expensive items and later slot items. They tend to have higher win rates and perform better, like statistically speaking. And again, if you want to learn even more about this, I would recommend. I think there's some good content out there. I can't think off the top of my head. I think Xpedu has some good ones, some good videos about this. I believe there's some good content out there. People talking about the science, like of item data and item win rates and stuff. Very interesting topic. I'm not going to get super in depth on it here, but yeah, there's a lot to think about there. I've covered some of the simpler stuff, but if you want to learn more, there's definitely some things out there you can look at. Are Baron forms the type of complexity that actually enrich League? I think Baron forms are a really interesting space. I actually think the pit shapes ended up being a lot more compelling than the Baron forms. We wanted to do both, and the original versions of the Baron forms, the Barons were more visually well differentiated. But then when we actually started putting that together, it was tough to make people actually recognize them all as Baron, and we ended up running into a lot of problems there. And so we backed off and decided, okay, the Barons will look the same, they'll just cast one different spell. I think the different spells that they cast ended up being a little bit too low interest and low gameplay in order, like, to make a real difference. And I think the conclusion that I've come to after seeing how the Baron forms have played out is that aspect of the Baron forms hasn't worked out super well. And I would say no, I don't think that they're super enriching. However, I do think the entire concept as a package, like with the modified terrain for the Baron pits, that I actually really like. I think the modified terrain really works, and I often wonder, like, is there a way we could play that up? Like, for example, suppose we took away all the special Baron attacks and we replaced them all with something that interacts with walls, right? That the Baron has. And so the actual difference between the Barons is not actually that the attack itself is different, but instead the way that the attack interacts with the pit is different. I think something like that could be a really good way of doing it, because that means that players can understand very easily, oh, this is a different experience doing the Baron because the pit is different. Because the differences on the pit, I think, actually have been enriching. And part of the value of the differences in the pit is not even just that the combat is different, which it is, and I think it's meaningfully different in some cases, right? Like if you ever tried to, like, do the tube Baron against like Rumble, for example, you may know, like, I may have a memorable moment there of like, oh my god, I'm getting cooked in the tube and I can't get away from the equalizer or whatever, right? It's like stuff like that I think is really cool. That kind of emergent gameplay is interesting, but it's visualized, right? Whereas I think the Baron spells, again, like I said, kind of ended up being a little bit too low gameplay and a little bit too poorly visualized. And we don't really want to, like, over gameplay, like, complexity up the epic monsters. This is something that, like, we talk about it. I think I've actually answered questions about this before in Q&As, but that was a long time ago. It's probably, you'd have to go way back in the Q&As to find this question. But um, if you go way back, you may have heard me talking about how every few years someone tries a version of the Baron is a more epic encounter, or the Dragon is a more epic encounter, and it's got mechanics and it's really cool. And inevitably, it's like, it's very easy to get people hyped up about this. It's such a cool pitch. It sounds awesome. And then the gameplay when we actually play it is like, oh, actually, I don't really want to be paying attention to Baron or Dragon when I'm fighting them. I don't want to actually have to devote much attention to the fight itself. The interest in these fights comes from the PvP aspects of, where's their jungler? Can I zone their jungler away from the pit? What vision do they have? Like how quickly are we DPSing the Baron, right? Like, you don't want the DPS to be, crazy highly variable because of mechanics. Like, your AD carry is dodging and can't be DPSing the Baron because they're, dodging its pizza slice attack or whatever, right? Ultimately, I think that the epic monsters in League are better served as low complexity low interest fights, and that's why I think fundamentally the forms and the different attacks that they have ended up not being that compelling for the game. Is that we don't have the complexity budget to spend on Baron's attacks to actually differentiate the attacks, in the spells to be super interesting. However, the pits, because they actually relate to directly to the way that you interact with the enemy players, and the pits are really well visualized because they're just walls that you can see, ended up did working really well in this space. And I think that if we were going to pursue more of this in the future, I would want to see things like what could their like other pits look like, or what ways could we make the Baron interact with the pits in ways that are interesting and compelling for the players. And that's sort of where my head's at in this space is the forms not amazing, the pits really cool, really good. I think that's how I look at it. Champion fantasy, but what about role fantasy? I think there's something to this. There's something we've been discussing a bit internally, especially when we started working on role quests in the first place, was what is the fantasy of a role and what does that even mean, right? It's something that, we've discussed, lightly in the past, but never really super seriously. But now that we have the role quests, I think there is actually some concrete attachment here. And I think it's an interesting thing to talk about around what does it mean to be in the bot lane carry role, right? Like the bare bones of it is you sort of have a support. Obviously, in the current meta, you often don't have a support; they abandon you. But you have a support. You're playing in a 2v2 lane, right? Most of the time, it's a somewhat 2v2 lane, and you're therefore you get less XP, but you get relatively more gold. And the role quest plays into that fantasy by saying, here's a whole extra item slot, and you get extra gold, right? You can play into that. And similarly, you can see how we tried to play into the fantasy of the other roles, right? Like the fantasy of the top lane being the sort of lone warrior. You get more XP. You're really strong. You're personally really powerful. You can you can persist on your own. You're more self-sufficient than the other players because you have such a high level. You get more XP. You want to be alone to get more XP or to get to level 20. You have higher level cap. And I think that there are definitely some possibilities that some pathways we could go down of doubling down on this in the role quests and saying, yeah, the bot lane is about the 2v2, right? And we want the support to not leave the lane at 3 minutes and not come back until, 5 minutes, right? Like we want the support to be in lane for, at least 80% of the first 10 minutes or whatever, or at least 90% of the first 10 minutes or whatever, right? Like, and we want the lane to be about the 2v2 specifically, and we want 80 carries to be good in the 2v2. Right. Not saying that, we can't have mages there as an example, right? That's a hot topic right now. I'm not really involved in that discussion. Of course, ongoing discussions internally about the current state of the game. I'm not going to speak much to that here. I've already talked about it in previous Q&As, and I'm not really an expert on the topic. Again, I'm not really working on the live game at all right now, or haven't really been this year at all. And so I'm sort of hands off there. But I think it's definitely a possibility that given the role quests have sort of dipped our toes in a little bit to the role fantasy, I think we could definitely see what happens if we played that up a bit more. I think what we've done with role fantasy so far, it's been solid, but not like, incredible, slam dunk, amazing, like we need to immediately pursue this. I think that there are definitely some things that work and some things that are not working, right? Like as an example, I think the mid quest is not super fantasy enhancing for mid laners. It's like the boots were kind of just there and they function, but they're not super amazing. I definitely think we could take a look at like mid and jungle for enhancing the fantasy more, and we could even try doubling down on like top and 80 carry, where I think the fantasies are currently working, but could probably be enhanced more. And I think there's definitely space for that in the game, but I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. And that's something that, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we decided to explore what is a more role fantasy centric version of the role quest system look like. I suspect the role quest system is definitely, well, I think it's definitely the role quest system that would have to be the vehicle for this. It's just the only thing that makes sense in this space. That's just why in the past we haven't really seriously discussed this that much, because we didn't have a good vehicle for role fantasies. But I think that this is definitely something that is an ongoing topic of discussion, and we'll see how it develops over time. Alrighty, that's going to be it for today's video, number 34. Again, apologies if there's anything weird going on with the video, or if it's uploaded at a weird time or not uploaded on time at all. Sorry. Again, I'm out of town, so this is pre-recorded message, and yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching as usual, and maybe catch you in number 35.